and they want to hear about it, you can let them know that they can see it in the future. Jim is in charge of this Zoom call, and he's renamed himself Questions to the Speakers. So he is available if you have any questions during the time that our speakers are talking. You can ask or you can just send a question to him. You don't have to send a question to everybody. I mean, you could, I guess, but it's easier if you just send them to him. And then he will arrange for the speakers to get those questions. I think during this call, everyone is going to be on mute when you're not talking, or when the speakers are talking, just to keep the quality up. And but otherwise, the best way to be in touch is just to do a question if you've got a concern. I will just say briefly that the Affirming Committee had always planned to do a talk on racism. But I think given how this spring has unfolded with all the really concerning and highly publicized issues in the States and in Canada, that we really felt it was important to do something a little bit more, do something a bit sooner, and also something that speaks a little bit more to specifically anti-Black racism and white privilege, because it's a sort of a specific issue within racism. This is not meant to be a definitive talk that we have and then we don't think about it anymore. This is really meant to be the beginning of a conversation that will continue over the next year and really the life of our church. As we all know, you know, those of us who might not experience anti-Black racism or racism in general, we don't, sometimes we really need to work on educating ourselves, and it's important that we do it with an open mind and in a way that allows us to just know that we're not all perfect and we all make mistakes, and we might say the wrong word, or we might ask a question that is a bit that we don't know the answer to, and it's okay to be it's okay to be questioning with a positive heart, you know. Anyway, I'm not going to talk any longer because we have such wonderful, wonderful speakers that we've been able to get for today's talk. And I just would like to say, although it's really unfortunate we can't be all in person, one thing that this Zoom technology does allow is it allows us to have speakers that aren't necessarily right in our community or right in our city. So I'll let you know that first we have Shannon McCarthy who's speaking. She's going to be speaking about white privilege. Shannon is the Executive Minister for Living Skies, Northern Spirit, and Prairie to Pine Regional Councils. She has recently begun chairing the General Council's White Privilege Working Group following a sabbatical, where she spent her time focusing on power and privilege, decolonizing structures, and understanding her own role and power in the system of the United Church. This arose as the Regional Council's She Resources worked to understand what it means to be intercultural. Shannon is a lifelong member of the United Church who grew up in Sault Ste. Marie, Robinson Superior Treaty. She's an ordained minister of 23 years and has spent all of her ministry in Western Canada. She's currently based in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory. So welcome, Shannon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
As well, after Shannon speaks, we have Marlene Britton. And Marlene is a okay, so I knew I was going to get this wrong. A diaconal minister in the United Church of Canada. Her roots are in the Methodist Church of the Caribbean and the Americas. And between the Methodist Church and the United Church, she's been in ministry for 27 years. She was born and nurtured in Jamaica, successfully completed her first degree in marine sciences and geology, and then responded to the call of God to ministry. After completing her theological studies, she served in Belize and Barbados before transferring to the UCC, where she served in Cold Lake, Alberta, and Thunder Bay, Ontario, before moving to the General Council. Marlene now serves as the Program Coordinator for Admissions and Pastoral Relations. She is also the proud mother of 2 handsome young men. So welcome, Marlene.
Thank you.
So thank you again. Just your short bios that you sent in just show how much experience you bring to this topic, and we really appreciate it. So maybe Shannon, you take it away, and then Marlene, it'll be your turn.
Okay, so I've agreed to talk a little bit about white privilege, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this conversation tonight. Conversations about race are never easy. They're important conversations to have, but they challenge us, and that's okay. And we want to make sure that you feel safe to ask questions in this space. We want you to do that with open hearts and open minds, and to listen. And when you feel yourself being challenged by something that is said, to step back and think about your own biases and your own reactions, and ask yourself, where is that coming from? What is that arising from? Nothing that we want to say tonight is intended to blame or put guilt on anyone or make anyone feel bad about their race. We want everyone to be proud about who they are. But we want to acknowledge the racism that exists in our world and in our system, and that it's hard work to work towards being anti-racist. And the United Church does want to be an anti-racist church. We are not an anti-racist church yet, and we're working on that. And so we want you to ask questions as we go. At the end, you can send them to questions to speaker, to Jim, and we'll try to answer them if we can. One of the things about racism, there's lots of resources. I've read some books, there's more books to read. I have a long summer reading list. I'm not an expert yet. I don't know if I ever will be an expert. But one of the things that really comes up first is that when we talk about racism or racists, we think about this sort of, racists are bad, and if you're a good person, you can't be racist because you're good. Your intentions are good. You want to be you're kind to people, but yet we live in a racist society, and that's hard for us to hear and to acknowledge. And we see some of the media about the States, and we think, well, we're better than that, and yet we know that Canada also has a racist history of colonization and a racist past. But we get caught in this, racists are the KKK. They're the people that lynched Black people for no discernible crime, innocent people. They're the people with swastikas tattooed on themselves or flying Nazi flags, and that kind of bad image of racism. And yet we know and we see it where there's lots of implicit bias or unintentional racism that we all have. We were raised to that without any intention of ourselves. And so it's to set aside that good bad binary of, you're either, if you're bad, you're racist, and if you're good, you're not racist, because we have to acknowledge our own place in the system. And one of those ways is to acknowledge our white privilege and to recognize that in our society, we have privilege based solely on the color of our skin. There are other privileges that exist in our society. Men have privilege that women don't have in some situations. Straight people have privilege over people who put themselves on the LGBTQ2A+ spectrum. And I'm a single person. I would say in this society, couples have privilege. So there's all kinds of privilege that we have and we work with and we balance. I have I have privilege based solely on my job and my role in the system of the United Church. I try to use that privilege for good, but I have to acknowledge that I have that privilege. So, and white privilege is one of those things that we need to acknowledge as white people in the system and to recognize it. And so one of the ways we can do that is by doing a bit of an inventory to just recognize where most of the time when we have white privilege, we don't even know where we have it or we're using our privilege. There's been lots in the media lately, so if you aren't hearing about white privilege, you're not seeing anything in the news or anything lately, and you're intentionally trying not to understand what that means. But I have a checklist, and I'd like to share it with you. Let's make sure I have my, I think this is it. There we go. I have too many windows open, that's my problem here. In my, sorry. There we go. This is what happens when I don't clean off my, it's not giving me it. Okay. Maybe I'll just read it, and once I get it able to share, I will. Doesn't seem to want to show up as a shareable one. So here, if you go through this list and you just make yourself a check mark if this is true for you, and then you can kind of do the math. I'm going to ask 20 questions. So the first one is, I can arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. So if that's true for you, you can check that list. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the newspaper and see people of my race widely represented. When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can be sure that my children will be given curriculum materials that testify to the existence of their race. I can go into a music shop and count on finding the music of my race represented, into a supermarket and find the food I grew up with, into a hairdresser shop and find someone who can deal with my hair. So that's all one question, but all of those things. Whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial responsibility. I am not made acutely aware that my shape, bearing, or body odor will be taken as a reflection of my race. I can worry about racism without being seen as self-interested or self-seeking. I can take a job or enroll in a college with an affirmative action policy without having my coworkers or peers assume I got it because of my race. I can be late to a meeting without having the lateness reflect on my race. I can choose public accommodation without fearing that people of my race cannot get in or will be mistreated. I am never asked to speak for all of the people of my racial group. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk with the person in charge, I will be facing a person of my race. If a traffic cop pulls me over, or if the CRA audits my tax return, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. I can easily buy posters, postcards, picture books, greeting cards, dolls, toys, and children's magazines featuring people of my race. I can choose makeup, face cover, or bandages in the flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. I can walk into a classroom and know I will not be the only member of my race. I can enroll in a class at college and be sure that the majority of my professors will be of my race. So those are just a few places where white privilege shows up in society. So you can do the math on your sheet and see where you are. I got 20 out of 20. So it's not a competition, but I recognize all those things. And then one of the things that happens with white privilege is there are times, and we've seen this, it's been really obvious lately, where white people are calling the police on Black people, particularly people of color, using the power of their whiteness to have the police act on a person of color. And that's a huge part of white privilege, knowing that if they do that normally, now it's a good thing right now that the system is saying, no, that is not okay, you shouldn't do that. But that's part of what it means to have white privilege, is to recognize in those places when we're using our privilege, where you've been in line somewhere and somebody's ahead of you as a person of color, and the person at the desk talks to you first. And that's white privilege. Many of you who are women will acknowledge that that often happens also with privilege between men and women, where as a woman, you're standing there and you're acknowledging it. But then you add in race and it becomes double privilege in those situations. So basically the definition of white privilege is the defensiveness, or the term for the way people and social institutions grant social privileges that benefit white people beyond what is commonly experienced by people of color under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. White privilege is not something that white people necessarily do, create, or enjoy on purpose. It refers more to the phenomenon that social systems award preference based on the presumptions of white as the norm. So it's not that we're asking you to not be white, it's to acknowledge whiteness and recognize the privilege and be aware of when people around you are not afforded that same privilege, and be willing to speak out about it and to say this isn't okay. And one of the reasons we have the White Privilege Working Group in the United Church is because we recognize that the work of being anti-racist is the work of white people. So if we put it into other situations, we have our own work to do, and we have work to do together with all of the people, regardless of color. But we also have work as white people to do. And one of the things that we can run into is something called white fragility. And there's been more conversation about this. There's a very popular book by Robin DiAngelo called White Fragility. And that's the defensiveness that we feel when our white privilege is challenged. And it's ingrained, and even our defensiveness. Somebody tells us a story where they feel like they were treated differently because of their race. We say, well, I'm sure they didn't intend that. Or, and the piece that I've learned to recognize is intention doesn't matter. You can have the best of intentions, but intention doesn't matter. It's impact that matters. And so it's recognizing when our privilege impact someone negatively of other color. And so then we have to work together to apologize for our impact and recognize, okay, even though I didn't intend that to be received that way, it was received that way. And therefore I need to have an open and honest conversation without getting defensive about how I cannot do that again. And so white fragility is the defensiveness and avoidance that arise for white people when facing even a minimal amount of racial stress. The feelings can be so uncomfortable that white people distance themselves from engaging or actively shut down conversations about race. It may surface as the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-induced situation. That's a privilege that we can do that we can not talk about race. So we can't do that anymore. We need to have this important conversation. We need to be actively engaging it, and we need to listen to our brothers and sisters and all people of all colors and race to be part of this conversation. So I will share, I used a vocabulary sheet, and I will share that with Jim and Martha to give to you. And I'll share that white privilege inventory as well. I'll send those as emails so that you can have those to reference for yourselves. But I think I'm at least at my 20 minutes, so I'll hand it over to Marlene, and I'm assuming we'll do questions after both of us have spoken. Is that right, Martha?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thanks so much, Shannon. I really appreciate it. So Marlene, over to you.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Martha. So when Shannon led us through that exercise in the first instance, I scored 2. And one of the 2 was music, because who doesn't love Bob Marley and all that great calypso music? So of course I can go in there and find lots of music, but hair stuff, I had to learn to do my own hair when it came to Canada because nobody could do it where I was. Anyway, and finding stuff to do my hair, yeah. And it's bad to say. I just got to the stage of saying, oh well, it's how life is, rather than maybe it shouldn't be that way, but yeah. So I do want to share with you a little bit from my experience. And one of the things that was mentioned in the checklist that Shannon shared was people don't expect you to speak on behalf of your race. And so I want to dispel that notion. I'm not speaking on behalf of all Black folks out there, number 1. Number 2, I am a Caribbean person. You heard that from the bio. I spent 40 years plus of my life in the Caribbean before migrating to Canada. So I spent those years in countries that were Black, that were run by Black people. I was educated by Black people, all my role models, my professors. So why wouldn't I think I was something special? Because that's the culture in which I was immersed. I served in 3 countries which have the Westminster system of government. They were British Commonwealth territories. So all of that, and then I moved to a country and I moved to the north of Alberta, by the way. It's a really different world. I don't know if any of you are here from Alberta, but it was a really different world from a place where Black people were in charge of stuff. I moved to a place where Confederate flags flew with reckless abandon. So it was a huge culture shift for me. So when I hear folks saying racism doesn't happen in Canada, I am intrigued because I know what I have experienced, me. Don't know anybody, can't speak about too many other people. But one of the things I do know is that I would have been through an orientation program when I first came through the admission program. And sorry, I want to share, so I'll do that. Yes. So what was interesting for me is that I did not get some things. Yeah. So I came from a system where being Black was important and good and so on. So we were taught a lot about that in our education, all through our education. I didn't get any of that when I was oriented to the United Church of Canada or to Canada, but found out through the by and bys that there was a kind of thought that racism doesn't happen here. Especially anti-Black racism doesn't happen here. Not in Canada, which, for heaven's sake, we are, and I'm proud to be, I can actually call myself a Canadian now because I did my swearing-in ceremony in February. I'm proud to be here and to live here and to say that Canada was the end point along the Underground Railroad. And that meant that had significant value for those persons who were coming from places where slaves were treated abominably. And Canada welcomed them and offered a different space. There's another part of that history that when slavery was done, they returned because, like Harriet Tubman said, it was hard feeling welcome in the spaces. So it doesn't happen here because we have the Underground Railroad and we're proud of that. But what does happen here is the systemic racism that is found in our healthcare system, in our education system, in our social services, in our policing. And I'm highlighting the health because COVID has exposed significant underbelly of our healthcare system, so that the Toronto neighborhoods with the highest burden of COVID-19 are also the Toronto neighborhoods with the highest percentage of Black folk. I happen to live, I happen to live in New York and just in that area down there. And all of this Northwestern Ontario area, which again, we can't be in stage 3 because, oh well. But the unfortunate part of it is that it is layered on top of the Black folks. There is a social dynamic to that. Yes, there is a real cultural difference between folks from the Caribbean, folks who are originally from Africa who have ancestors from Africa, with our social systems. And if any of you are social scientists, I'm preaching to the choir, right? We have different structural social systems. Our societies are not individualistic societies. We're very much the social societies. We operate in family structures and in 3-tier family structures where great-grandmothers live to 106 and live with the 2 generations of children because they used to look after the children so they didn't go to daycare, and then you take care. So it means there are a lot of people living together. And then in these neighborhoods where they're literally on top of each other in the places that they could afford, which are not exactly the greatest places. So it then means healthcare and provision of that is lowered. It means these are the same persons who work at the services, the essential services. These are the PSWs who must also take public transport to get to work. So all the layers, all the layers. Anyway, so that's what happens here. What does happen here? I had to figure out where, I will admit, I only moved to Toronto in December of last year, meaning December 27th. So, and I worked, because I did work for GCO, but from remotely until December last year. And then COVID hit, so I don't know Toronto very well. So I had to look up where Runnymede was, with Shannon's help, of course, and recognize that it was close to where these were found. Yeah. They're horrible symbols that trigger Black people, because this is how slaves were punished. Nobody says that we're not going to do that, because it represents all that was horrible about slavery and brings back all of that. It triggered me. And yes, my great-grandmother was a slave, but I wasn't. But just seeing that was enough. And that happened here. This didn't happen south of the border. And this happened last month, right here. So it doesn't happen. As I said in the bio, I am the proud mother of 2 boys. And I like to say 2 strong, handsome, Black boys. And I worry about them every single day. This one is 20. This one is 18. By the way, I'm wearing 3-inch heels in this picture. And I'm 5'8" tall. So this one is 6'2", and this one is just about 6 foot. And I worry about them, because 2 Black young men like that on the streets, this one has already been stopped by police. They live in Alberta, I must point that out, has already been stopped by police, even though he was with 2 white friends at a bus stop, them wanting to know, what was he doing there? Yep. This one is extremely industrious, so I'm a proud mother, I'm gonna say all these things, right? He was the MC at his graduation this year, yeah. And he goes to work at 5 in the morning. He starts his shift at 5:30 in the morning at Walmart. It's a 15-minute walk from where they live. And I worry when he does that in winter. I'm not worried about him slipping and falling on the ice, but it's dark. And the possibilities are just too bizarre to even think about. So after the second time he did it, because I nagged him so much, he then made his father take him to work during the winter. During the summer, you can walk, you can ride, but not when it's dark and a Black 6'2" young man is walking in the dark of the streets to work. It's just too much, because there is a thing called systemic racism in the system. So I work with the GCO, and if you look at the GCO staff, we're extremely diverse. It's wonderful. But when you look at the congregations, not so much. You know that of which I speak. Yeah. What have I experienced from this? I was in Alberta, where Shannon is now executive minister, and I was interviewed for a job. Well, first, they saw my resume and said, good. So they wouldn't have seen me first, but you saw my name, so you would know I'm a woman. And then when I turned up for the interview and did the interview, I didn't hear back from anybody. And this is like 6 weeks, literally 6 weeks after I called to ask, are you going with somebody else? What's going on? And they said, oh yes, the search committee chair said, oh yes, we're going with someone else. We were supposed to let you know, but our church has never hired a woman before. So we thought it would be really hard to go with you. And I found that really interesting, because when you looked at my resume, you could tell Marlene is not one of those names that you know, is given to a boy or persons who identify as male. Anyway, that was fine. I later received an invitation from my presbytery conference and then presbytery at the time to attend the covenanting service at this church for a woman. But of course she was white, so that was okay. But it was not okay for me. But where does one complain for that? It's just in the system, and it's our United Church, right? The systemic nature of racism showed up again with those two boys. This younger one was in school. He was in grade 7 at the time. And their father is also clergy. And small town, northern Alberta, everybody knows who their father is. In fact, the church was across from the school where they attended. And one day we got a call asking us to come down because there had been an incident. The incident was that math class had just ended and teacher and a TA were in the room, and my child was in the midst of a group, and this group was, you know, having a good time, and one fellow was saying, oh, I have one for you. I have one for you. This is for you, Chris. What do you call a Black priest? They all knew who his father was. Holy shit. This child hauled off and punched him in his face. I'm not going to tell you whether it was right or wrong. I won't tell you what I thought. But that's why we were called down to the school. Principal dealt with it beautifully. Both parties were dealt with. And I was working because I couldn't work in Cold Lake as a minister because there was only one United Church. So I was working for the province. I was working for Family and Community Support Services. And I went to work the next day and shared what had happened with my colleagues at work and said, you know, we're actually quite worried. Suppose a lawyer calls us now because a child punched another kid. And they said, don't even worry about it. This is Cold Lake. Nobody's going to call you because that is what is happening in that child's family. That 12-year-old didn't just come up with that. And that was actually worse for me. Because then it's going to continue. It's just going to continue. When I probably deserved it. I stole a parking space in the middle of Christmas, because who doesn't do that? And as I stepped out of the car, the person who I stole it from yelled, "You Black bitch." No, I don't mind being called a bitch because I was probably being bitchy, but so why do you have to preface it with Black? Because our system has said Black is, in that context, is not a great word. Whereas my system had told me Black is beautiful. Yep. So different. And then there, of course, is the stereotypes. So you heard about it, like Black people are always late, Black people smell, Black people, and Black people are idiots. Black people can't be understood. You won't understand their accents. And those kind of microaggressions and so on are what we live with every day, every single day. Then we have the social stereotypes. So last example I'm giving to you, last year when I was working for GCU, I lived in Barrie. And when I was going to look for that place, I have a great friend who's a minister, white, and I stayed with her and her husband in Barrie while I was looking for a place. And she came out with me to go look at places. I had made the appointments, my name, first place we show up for, and we're introduced. So I'm the person who made the appointment. He heard, and he proceeds to talk to her for the whole time. So the thing was finished, even in terms of giving the papers to be signed. Anyway, we get back in the car because she's driving me around. She says, did I just dream that that happened? And I said, no, you know, and she's going to apologize. And I said, you know, I know you're apologizing because it's the system, but it's not your fault. She didn't go in with me to the second appointment, but I made her come into the third because the whole point was I needed another set of eyes and that sort of thing. And she was feeling so bad that if she was there, they wouldn't pay attention to me. I wouldn't matter in that instance because privilege would allow them to speak to her and not to me. It's interesting. But these are my strong young men. And that is why I fear for them. Because they're strong. Yeah. And that's just a boastful picture. I'll tell you that up front right there. And this, though, is where I am hopeful. Because this is the same place where the nooses were found. That was transformed by community, Regent Park community, into something else. And that is what I'm hoping will come out of this whole experience, that there will be a transformation, that the kind of microaggressions and the kind of systemic and the kind of stereotyping that I have no doubt lots of my other Black kinfolk have experienced would not continue because the community is saying enough is enough. This is what we want. This is what we want. We don't want the other things. So, what can you do? Exactly what you're doing now. Learning some stuff about some other stuff. And then, so you're starting with where you are, figuring out where you want to go and how you will get there. So we know it's going to be a process, but I'm so happy you're taking at least these first steps. I've shared with Martha the document that our GCE, or our General Council Executive, has as a referral, a proposal as to what are some of the things that can be done to work with anti-Black racism. So that has material in there. And then I have one more link that I will share with her, which speaks about systemic racism in Canada and how that has come about and what can be done by folks. So, went a little bit over to one.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, Marlene. That's like really important for us to hear. And I have a son, and I often think about the difference that I experience with my white son, not worrying about him going out into the community, versus my racialized friends and their worries about their sons. And I think it's something that seems to be almost universal within, especially people that are dealing with anti-Black racism, that they're so worried about their sons, and it must just be never ending.
Yeah, it's brutal. Anyway.
But so I guess now would be the time if you've got any questions. I know for myself, I have a really hard time, Shannon, when I'm not usually around people that are overtly racist or say overtly racist things. Like, you know, my white friends are usually the kind of people that, you know, are kind of, they're not going to say a really racist joke. But it's the undercurrent of something that happens. It's a little bit less obvious, that you can't kind of say, hey, that was off color, or that might be actually a racist term now that I think about it, but you can't say, hey, I have a problem with that, or call them out. But I have to say, I get very uncomfortable in that moment of calling somebody on something that they've said that's sort of a little bit racist or a little bit problematic. And I wonder if you have any kind of thoughts on that, or any sort of suggestions for that, because I really, I know it's something that I struggle with. I don't like to make people feel uncomfortable who are around me. You know what I mean? That feeling.
For sure. And this is one of the things actually that Robin DiAngelo talks about in her book, White Fragility, is that most people know, we've gotten to the place where we know what overt racism looks like and sounds like, and we know that we shouldn't use those terms and words and so on. So we've put it underground essentially, and we talk about sketchy neighborhoods, or the wrong side of the tracks, or we use kind of phrases. It comes up a lot in real estate, actually. Marlene mentioned it there too, where there's sort of code words for what's a bad neighborhood. And very often bad neighborhoods are neighborhoods that are not mostly white. Let's be honest, that's the perception of that in society. And so we have these kind of code words. I think it's important for us when we're engaging in any kind of hard conversation to, one, public confrontation and public shaming is not helpful for anybody. So it's to ask the question, why do you say that? What do you mean when you say that? To ask those kind of open, honest questions, and to try to go in without a lot of judgment, but to challenge and push people a little bit. One of the ones that I think we're hearing a lot now is people saying, but I don't understand, all lives matter. And I think all of us would agree, yes, that's true. But there are times when we need to say, but they're not all treated equally in the society. So right now we need to say Black lives matter, Indigenous lives matter, and recognize that there's a higher need. And I think one of the best sort of comparisons is, all homes matter, but the house that's on fire is the one you send the fire department to. So right now we're sending the fire department to our racialized friends and neighbors because their lives are the ones that are at risk right now. Their sons are the ones who are in danger. So how do we work within our system? It's never easy. And sometimes it's floating things gently, opening the door for conversation, and then stepping away from it. Floating things gently, opening it for conversation. So I can tell you, and you may be experiencing this in your conversations about being an affirming congregation, that there are some people who just have a really hard time with understanding what it means to be gay or lesbian or trans, all of the different ones. So I had those same conversations with my parents, I don't know how long ago, and it was really hard for them. And then they met some friends of mine who were gay and adopted some kids, and then not very long ago, I came out to them as asexual, and they were like, yeah, okay, good, thanks for telling me. And it was no big deal, but it took us 20 years to get there. And so you're not gonna change your friend's mind, but you can talk about this interesting book you read, or this interesting article, or did you see this on Facebook? And I mean, I do think it's important to risk confrontation when people are overtly racist on Facebook, and for sure that's we need to do that. And then we also need to learn the skills to talk to our friends and neighbors when they're naming those kind of systemic biases. and challenge them on that. And it's not easy. And I've noticed lots of memes about it, about kind of ways you can engage those conversations. And there's more resources than you can dream about out there. But I think that's one, is just to be gentle as you can. I think somebody shared a story about they're a minister, and one of their congregants said, "But all lives matter." And then they engaged in that conversation about why that wasn't a good thing to say right now. And then they understood, and they were able to engage in the conversation about why it is important for us to be saying as a church, why we said Black Lives Matter to the United Church of Canada, and what that really means, and that there needs to be actions behind those statements, that we need to talk. We need to engage our school boards. We need to talk to our city councils. We need to talk to our transit commissions about the ways that the systemic racism affects all of those institutions that Marlene named. I don't know if that helps or not, but.
So thanks, Shannon, sorry. But Marlene, I was wondering also if you have any sort of examples of times where you've been in predominantly white sort of groups, like our congregation is, and things that have happened or experiences that you've had where you might have thought, oh, that was actually a good example of some way that someone could make me feel welcome or comfortable. I mean, I know we all know I think we all have an idea of what we do that makes other people feel welcome. But I'm just wondering if you have examples from your own life of things that have happened that have made you thought, oh, you know what, that was actually a good experience for me. Awkward question.
So the two pastoral charges that I served were white. And in going into them, like Thunder Bay, that was the first time they'd had anybody that wasn't white serving them. So they didn't do anything in particular to make me, I guess they just didn't know what they could have done. However, I will say, there was no doubt after we got to know each other that I was a definite part of their family, their unit, their so on. So much so that when, unfortunately, I have a litany of very racist incidents, but when this one particular one happened, and I'll share it with you, I was walking, I did share it. So if you heard the story before, that's fine, because it was in the Observer, when it was the Observer. I was heading to Tim Hortons to meet with a few of the folks from my church there. And I'm walking past a group of youngsters, and I don't know what it is about making jokes, but this was a group of older teenagers this time. And it was summer, so I had on a nice dress and everything. And I'm stepping along, and I like heels, so, you know, I was working. And I heard the comment, what do Batman and Black people have in common? No, I'm in Thunder Bay. I'm the only Black person even anywhere around. And I'm walking past. What do Batman and a Black person have in common? What? They can't go out at night without robbing.
Yeah.
Ooh, really funny. But none of you are laughing.
Yeah.
And I wasn't laughing either. And in that moment, I was stunned. And I'm never usually at a loss for words, but I was. And I was also in that moment not sure what to do, because I looked back and saw youngsters who were then 17, 18, who were not small either. So what was I gonna do? And I walked into the coffee shop, and something was wrong, and I said what was wrong, and I mean, they were furious, and they responded. One person was extremely mad, and by the time she got up, they had run away, and the congregation itself responded in such a way that it was literally a surrounding me with love and protection and vocal and verbal statements of this is just not okay, and we're not standing for this, and we really have to do something. So it started a whole different scenario with me being able to interact with school boards. For instance, one school board invited me to come and do some things with them. So yeah, that was their expression, their very tangible expression of, no, you are part of us. This is just not okay. We're just not going to leave this here. But that came, you know, with at least after a year of my being there and of us learning about each other and accepting each other and that sort of thing. Now, so by the time I was leaving, I will say this to you, by the time I was leaving, the last service that I was part of, the choir got a band together and sang One Love by Bob Marley, which is how I choose to sign my personal emails. Not the ones that are on United Church letterhead, but because it's one of my signature mantras. And by the time I was leaving, that was the point they were at. So now I get emails from them saying, okay, we're thinking about this ministry. Do you think it would be okay if we do this to welcome them? Some of the things they're thinking about is getting somebody else from that person's culture to be part of a mentoring system for them, to look for places where they could probably get local foods, source local foods and that sort of thing. So, and you don't know how important those kinds of things are for folks like me. Yeah. Although potato is a wonderful root, whatever it is, but there's stuff. And just knowing that if somebody, so in that context, somebody was coming from Winnipeg, there was a wonderful shop that I found out there that then they could, you know, bring some stuff down, just those little things. In Toronto, it's a different thing, but it's finding out you're in a neighborhood that may or may not, I don't know, because I don't know Toronto very well, may have folks around, may have areas that you could possibly find some interaction with. I don't know, but those are the things.
And I know it's 8 o'clock, but we do have just one more question, and I just wanted to ask it because I think it is so important. You have talked a little bit about this, but just Marlene, if you could just talk a little bit more about the idea of microaggressions. What are sort of some common ones, and what should we be looking for in ourselves and in other people around those?
So I'll tell you, first thing, did anybody, I'm looking, fortunately, I have one of those screens that I can see everybody. Did anybody not understand my presentation this evening? Anybody have any, just with a shake of head or raise your hand, anybody have any issues? It was all good? Right. So one of the things I'd hate for you to tell me after this when you meet me somewhere, wow, you're articulate. Nobody says that to Martha. Yeah. Because it's when you say that to me, it's like you didn't expect me to be articulate. And that is it's almost like it's the expectation that I'm not sure if we're going to be able to understand them or even if they'll be able to string a sentence together. So, wow, when somebody does it and does it well, so that's one. Another thing is, so Shannon mentioned the lateness. I desperately make every effort to get in there on time because there's this whole thing that those people are always late for everything. There is also the thing of, I know my hair is fabulous. You can, I know it's wonderful, but don't put your hand in there. If you want to hear about it, so you might not guess it yet, but I'm an extrovert. So I do not mind at all telling you about it. And it's actually pretty fabulous right now that it's rolled up on itself. It actually goes all the way down to my back and it's all mine. And I could undo it and show it to you if we had 20 more minutes. I don't mind doing it if you ask me. Yeah, but don't just come up and go, oh, because then I'll get upset. And then even things like that question, which is very well-meaning, very, very well-meaning. So in Shannon's bio, she told you she grew up in Sault Ste. Marie and she served most of her life in Western Canada. So when you ask Shannon where she's from, that's what you're expecting, right? When you ask someone like me where they're from, what are you expecting? And I very deliberately and very nicely, when I go to conferences and I didn't live in Toronto and they asked where I'm from, I'd say Thunder Bay. Oh, yeah. And I like Scottish country dancing. Don't I look Scottish? But that's the point, because when it is done in that way, because then they either back up and say, oh, that's not what I mean, or they don't say anything more. You're already making the assumption that I don't belong. I don't belong to Canada, so I must be from somewhere else. So yes, I understand that we do ask those questions, like where you're from. But Marlene, where you live? Somebody here asked me where it must have been Martha when we came on first. So where exactly are you now? Great. Make no assumptions. And then move on from there. Because again, people who know will recognize that I do not have an accent that sounds like the country in which I was born. So guess what? I cultivated that because of the microaggressions. Because as soon as you start sounding like a Jamaican, there is an expectation that you are only able to do certain things, like dance hall music, which I don't know anything about. So, yeah, it's well, those kinds of things.
Well, thank you very, very much. That's really helpful. And I just again want to thank you both, as well as everyone that came to listen to you speak here tonight. We would love, you both are welcome at Runnymede United Church anytime. And we'd love to sometime make you feel welcome at our church.
I see those hands. I see those hands.
There you go. Anyway, I think unless there's anything else, Jim, I think that's the end of our program for tonight. And we will, just to let you all know, we are going to be doing more of these in probably the later summer, the fall. And as I said, I think we will, this is just the beginning of a conversation that has so many facets and is so complicated, but it's one that can start, and we will continue it for many years to come, probably. Many people saying thank you, Shannon and Marlene, on the chat. So
thank you.
Everyone,
thank you.
Please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just for people, if you're interested, there is a website now called United Against Racism that just some different people have created. The father of those beautiful boys that Marlene showed. And one of the things we're trying to promote and celebrate is August 1st is the date that Canada emancipated its slaves. And we're trying to get some more information about what does that mean? Did slavery even exist in Canada? Yes, it did. And Emancipation Day was August 1st. And so there's great information and lots of resources on that website, as well as the General Council website. if you want further information, and feel free to email myself or Marlene and we can send you.
Yeah, for sure.
Perfect. And if any, and also any, if anyone wants to connect with Shannon or Marlene, anyone on the affirming committee will have that contact too. So we can put you in touch if you need it.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you
Perfect.
all.
Thanks.
Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.